as D.D. Kerman flew his reconnaissance aircraft over the island of Kuba. Anti-aircraft fire disabled his engines and his control surfaces. D.D. was forced to ditch his aircraft just a few kilometers off the coast of the island. Now, with the island defenses on high alert, what will be D.D.'s fate? I am Echo 3, and let's continue discussing the Cold War. Quick thinking, Jebediah Kerman has a plan. He will replace his landing gear for pontoons. Perhaps the use of a low-flying civilian aircraft will escape notice. Jebediah has never flown a seaplane before, but Jebediah wonders, how hard is it really to land a seaplane in enemy-held territory at night and find a stranded pilot in the middle of the ocean? With Jebediah seemingly unaware of the challenges that lay ahead of him, he takes off into the dark. For this rescue mission, Jeb is flying extremely low, about 100 meters above the water. This should help him avoid any detection by communist radar. Fortunately, D.D.'s locator beacon puts him a couple kilometers away from the island. As Jeb approaches D.D.'s position, he gently brings the plane down onto the surface of the water. Landing a float plane is particularly tricky, as the plane sometimes will want to flip. D.D. does not appear to have suffered any injuries and is able to swim over to the aircraft. He quickly scampers onto the pontoon, then onto the wing, and then gets into the passenger seat. With D.D. on board, Jeb points the aircraft back towards the Space Center and takes off. As they fly back, D.D. confirms that the communists are definitely setting up some kind of missile base on the island. There is at least one mobile launcher on the island. This puts both the Space Center and the island airfield within reach of communist nuclear missiles. As they fly back to the Space Center, D.D. radios in the intelligence he has gathered. The Central Kuban Alliance Network leadership is understandably upset. They have vowed to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons near their territory. Some are calling for an airstrike against Kuba. Others suggest an all-out invasion. Whatever CCAN leadership and President Kennedy Kerman decide, they must act quickly before more communist weapons arrive on the island. President Kennedy is left with some difficult decisions. He needs to keep his Kerbal safe, but he also wants to avoid war with Khrushchev Kerman. With all this talk of war, the Space Center was still hoping to conduct some science. Ground-based telescopes have noticed something interesting about Joule's innermost moon. Lathe appears to have an atmosphere and possibly liquid water on its surface. If this is confirmed, it would mean that Lathe is the only moon in the Kerbal system that has an atmosphere. However, ground-based telescopes can only tell so much. Astronomers have been begging for a telescope to be placed in high Kerbin orbit. However, the satellite must not exceed 10,000 funds, as the current military threats facing CCAN are taking a large chunk of the budget. The satellite has come in at just under 10,000 funds, and the launch vehicle another 10,000. CCAN has given permission for this project to proceed. This particular mission and its requirements were suggested by subscriber Not Another Time Lord 21. Engineers were trying to come up with some kind of hot name for this telescope, and eventually settled on High Orbit Telescope, which, as an acronym, does technically qualify as a hot name. The telescope isn't very massive, and the Skipper engine easily powers this craft through the lower atmosphere. The lower stage is able to quickly accelerate the craft over 1800 meters per second. This will leave the telescope with plenty of fuel for its own maneuvers. At 65 kilometers, the fairings are jettisoned, and the booster stage is decoupled. The solar panels are deployed, then the Terrier engine fires to place the craft into a high orbit. A telescope this large will provide an excellent opportunity for observing the other planets, although perhaps the Central Kerbin Alliance Network leadership has ulterior motives, as telescopes this large are also very good at observing Kerbin. For now, though, the mission is to take a good look at Joule and its moons. Scientists have targeted Joule and are now attempting to orient the camera. They spin things around just a little bit. It looks like the reaction wheels are working well. With the telescope now pointed generally at Joule, they activate the camera, and within moments, the first images come into view. They begin to zoom in on the planet and its moons. Scientists are struggling to keep the camera pointed exactly where they need it. Upgrades in Stability Assist software would make missions like this easier. Val and Tylo come into view. Scientists will still have to wait several days to get a good view of the moon lathe. But as is, the instruments appear to be working well. Perhaps one day, Kerbal will advance enough to send crew out to explore this planet and its moons. But currently, CCAN has other priorities. The Coast Guard reports that a boat has capsized. Fortunately, the CCAN Navy has a destroyer close by. And this isn't an old destroyer either. This is CCAN's latest class of guided missile destroyers. This new class of destroyer is able to carry, among other things, anti-ship missiles. The ship also includes the latest radar and sonar technologies. After picking up the stranded sailors, the crew has orders to make their way towards Kuba. Quickly, the destroyer makes its way to the stranded Kerbals. CCAN leadership, including President Kennedy Kuban, are adamant that no more weapons must reach Kuba. However, the president doesn't think that an invasion or an airstrike is prudent at this time. Instead, he's calling for a naval blockade of the island. Well, he didn't use the word blockade, he used the word quarantine, because a blockade is an act of war, and the president doesn't want the Cold War to go hot. With the last sailor on board, the ship steams back towards port. The crew must quickly return the stranded sailors to port, and then make their way to Kuba. A report has just come in that the communists are attempting to send more ships and supplies to Kuba. The communists are also fielding a new destroyer, the Kuban, and at this time, very little is known about communist submarine technology. Hopefully, the president's quarantine measure works, but if it doesn't, what then? Will the communists back off from the quarantine line, or will they keep sailing? If the communists attempt to go through the quarantine, will the Central Kerbal Alliance network ships fire on them first? The guided missile destroyer reaches the port and drops off the two stranded sailors. The crew then quickly head out and make their way towards the quarantine line. As the CCAN destroyer heads to its position, a Kuban-class destroyer is detected. The communist destroyer is sailing directly towards Kuba. The crew of the CCAN destroyer watches their radar for contacts and begins preparing their weapons. On the horizon now, the Kuban-class destroyer can be seen. While the distance between the two ships decreases, the tension increases. It's a high-stake game of chicken, with nuclear war on the line. The ships are within visual range. Valentina and the crew of the guided missile destroyer arm their cannon. With their radar, they will be able to lock on to the communist ship. Valentina radios the situation back to CCAN command. The CCAN destroyer points her cannon at the communist destroyer. Should they fire a warning shot first? Should they launch a missile salvo? Should they do nothing? The situation has been relayed to the president. Should CCAN wait for the communists to fire the first shot? Or will Valentina act on her own accord? I am Echo 3, and thanks for joining me to discuss the Cold War. I will see you next time.